The Life of Justinian. Who was Justinian? Justinian was born in 482 AD in Teresium, the Republic of Northern Macedonia. However, he wasn't always the Justinian that history recognizes. Justinian was born as Flavius Petrus Sabaius. The name Sabaius came from Justinian's father. As he aged, he worked as a swineherd. His uncle, Justin, had no previous education or children of his own. Because of this matter, he wanted to provide a strong education for his nephew. Justin taught himself the important aspects of education and then later retaught Sabaius several important aspects of an education as well. Justin and Sabaius were quite close. Justin later legally adopted Sabaius and renamed Justinianus to honor his uncle, or rather his new father. However, when recognizing him, history dropped Justinianus to just Justinian. His uncle was asked to work as a part of the previous government, but he knew he couldn't go at it alone. So he asked Justinian to work alongside of him since he knew his capabilities. Justinian had hopes and wishes to rebuild Rome. He desired to restore Rome in all aspects: a better army, a stronger currency, to fix taxation issues, establish monuments, and rewrite the law. All the features he viewed a perfect country would have. Justinian began to work hard to restore Rome and motivated others to do so. However, before he was emperor, there were only so many actions he had control of. Justinian's accomplishments as a government official. Justinian first makes peace with a man named Vitalium. Vitalium was to help Justinian restore Rome. However, he quickly became too powerful and used his power in a negative aspect. After this matter, Justinian has Vitalium assassinated once he returned to Byzantium. Justinian later meets a girl named Theodora and instantly grows fond of her. Theodora was an actress, a job that came with many things, including prostitution. Justinian and Theodora fall in love and live with one another, however, were not able to marry due to the law that government officials and actresses could not be married. Justinian's uncle Justin was willing to remove this law for his nephew. However, his aunt that loved him dearly refused. After his aunt's passing, the rule was removed, and Justinian's uncle Justin passed away shortly after his wife. Justinian's accomplishments as emperor. Justinian becomes the sole emperor of the Byzantine in 527 AD. He lives in Constantinople. Justinian still seeks to reform almost every aspect of the empire. Justinian searches and finds the most powerful men at the time to help him attack all the things he viewed wrong in the imperium. At this time, the Roman Empire was partially tied to the Mediterranean and growing away from the peninsula centered in the sea. This would later be an advantage for Justinian as he tries to build up the Roman society. Here is a map of the Byzantine Empire in 527, the beginning of Justinian's rule. Justinian dreamed of recreating legal forms, constructing architecture, beginning growth for the army, expanding Christianity to all, and overall beginning fresh innovations for the empire he dreamed of running. Justinian knew in order to execute his plans, he would need assistance doing so. Justinian searches and finds the most powerful men at the time to help him attack all the things he viewed wrong with the imperium. When searching for the men that had the capabilities to assist him, Justinian meets a man named John the Cappadocian to help him fix the taxing system. The previous issue being the rich ignored their taxes, and the poor were too poor to pay them at all. John comes in and completely overhauls the old tax system and corrects corruption. John had many methods in doing this, one being torturing the rich until they paid their taxes. After the tax system was corrected, John the Cappadocian benefited greatly, but two eventually became too powerful and faded away from the empire. Justinian's next desire was to fix the legal code. Over the years, the legal code had laws added, laws changed, or even overturned without much recollection or even notice, causing the legal system to become, well, a mess. Justinian meets a man named Tribonian. He became his legal advisor and utilized his intelligence to unmangle the previous code in a little over a year, 14 months to be exact. The legal code was corrected and made applicable to all citizens in the empire, whether it be rich, the poor, officials, people with higher powers, etc. However, as time went on, Tribonian too caught a sense that the rules no longer applied to him, since he was the one who instilled them. Tribonian began to rebel and later faded away from the empire. Problems began to arise with the Persians, as they tried to invade the empire, leaving Justinian figuring out how to stop them. He was correcting the empire piece by piece and couldn't afford to have anyone causing destruction. Although Justinian was not a soldier himself, he was humble enough to know he did not have the experience, so he decided it was time to call in an expert. Justinian meets a man named Belisarius, a very important person in Justinian's overall rule. Justinian instantly takes notice of his brilliance. The current Roman armies were suffering from repetitive defeat from the Persians. Belisarius created a tactical plan to defeat the army that was nearly twice the size of his. Belisarius and his men break their enemies into various sections, each section with a different job to carry out. His men fight stealthily and ruthlessly and still come out with a win. After victory, the southeast border was secured and a creation of peace was established for the east. In battle, there is a lot of risk of injury as soldiers move quickly, utilizing weapons against every man. In this circumstance, it was crucial for troops to wear armor that would prevent less injury. At this time, the Roman troops wore a square breastplate that was approximately 20 centimeters. They also wore what was called a heart guard on their chest, and that was designed to protect both the heart and chest. They also wore what was called a greave. The greave was worn on the leg, specifically the left leg, as it was the leg that was exposed during battle. These men also carried a metal shield to deflect from any incoming arrows. In 532, Justinian held a chariot race in the Hippodrome. When he arrives, Justinian expects to hear loud screams and cheers from his people. He is found quite surprised when people are chanting, but not for him, rather at him. The crowd cheers and banters for Justinian. The Hippodrome is filled with tens of thousands of people, and each of them cheering against Justinian. Moments later, the chant changes. The citizens in the Hippodrome begin to shout, Nika, a term meaning conquering in Rome. Justinian does not want to interact with the citizens' violent cheers and fears of adding to the fire and making things worse. Instead, Justinian flees the Hippodrome through a secret exit and makes his way back to the palace. A reminder that the blue and green demes are normally rivals in Rome. However, this time they are joined together as allies. The Nika Revolt. The mob leaves the Hippodrome and flees to the streets of Constantinople. The mob utilizes fire as their greatest weapon. The mob ventures through the town and is led to the palace that sets its gates on fire. The fire builds and begins to spread through Constantinople. The fire spread to Hagia Sophia, which was the center of worship for the empire. The mob intended to not only send the empire up in smoke, but to take out all of the important places or monuments. The fire next spread to the Baths of Zeuxippus, an important monument as it was built by the famous Constantine. The following day, most of the palace was burnt up and in ruins, completely destroying the home of Justinian and Theodora. The prison was burned down by the mob that led to letting all the prisoners loose and back into the city, obviously adding to destruction of the city that was already in shambles. The riots continued and left the city burning for 5 days. By the end of the riot, the city was left to nothing but smoke and ruins. A few days later, the crowd returned for the games in the Hippodrome. Justinian hoping for a better outcome than the last, the crowd continued with the violent chants towards Justinian. Although Justinian attempted to create a peace with the mob, no agreement could satisfy them. The mob begins to call for John the Cappadocian and Tribonian, wishing violence to them both. This started the idea that the mob was being attacked by the senators unhappy with taxation and new laws. Justinian, unsure of what he could do, creates an idea to arrange for his treasury and other loyal men to board ships and flee the empire by sailing across the Bosphorus. Justinian and Theodora hide out in protection. Meanwhile, the mob continues to raid the city. While Justinian and Theodora hide out, relatives of the former empire take control of the empire. A man named Hippolytus, who was also a relative of the former emperor, had no desire to help. He feared the mob and its power. However, the mob found Hippolytus hiding out and kidnapped him and led him to the city to become the new emperor against his wishes. Although Justinian believes it was safer for him to flee, Theodora refused to let him do so. She explains that it's his duty as emperor to guide the people and keep them safe. Who would protect the empire and save it once destruction was over? Justinian then calls for 3 men to assist him in repairing the damage that had done. Those men were Justinian's right-hand man Belisarius, Mundus, another great general, and Narses, a eunuch that worked in the palace. Narses was trusted by Justinian and appointed his master of treasury. Justinian sends Narses to the hippodrome to bribe the mob with gold, in exchange to stop the destruction for the city. Narses reminds the men that Justinian was in favor of the blue deans, and Hippolytus, the man they kidnapped, favored the greens. Some of the blues took the gold and dispersed. However, thousands of both colored deans remained. Belisarius and Mundus created a plan to take their men and split. Each army would enter the hippodrome through a different side and begin to attack the mob. The battle was gruesome, leaving blood, gluts, and 30,000 dead citizens in the hippodrome. However, Justinian was never challenged again. Rebuilding Constantinople. 39 days after the riots ended, the rebuilding of the Hagia Sophia began. After it was rebuilt, treasure from all around the empire was sent in to add the church's walls and pay the workers who repaired it. The rebuilding was not done there. People from all around the city reunited and worked together to reconstruct the damage. Justinian begins to rebuild the West. His works began in northern Africa as it held most Rome's stable and greatest territories. North Africa was immune to invasions, making it the strongest place to rebuild. In order to completely restore Rome, Justinian would need to break the previous peace between the Romans and the Vandals. This would be a difficult task as the Vandals' current ruler was very fond of Justinian. When Justinian finds a reason to break the peace, he begins to fight a diplomatic war himself. He worked to get Tripolitania, the eastern part of the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, and Sardinia, to join them in revolt. The seas were set for Belisarius, his men, and fleet to land in Africa unnoticed. When they arrived, Belisarius' men began to hunt the countryside for food and other loot. Belisarius ordered them to stop as their act was to be non-violent and reminded them that anything they took they would also pay for. His men were to be viewed as liberators, not conquerors, and were to treat the citizens as they would Romans. Belisarius quickly wins over the local populace, and they open the town for him and his men. They provided water and grain to them. This meant the plan was a success, and he and his men could head for Carthage. The Vandals got word of Belisarius and his men's plans, so they planned a secret attack against them to attack them from both the front and behind. The front of the army was too late, and Belisarius and his men had beaten them to the location. The rear army began their attack, but were only pushing Romans towards Carthage. Accepting their defeat, the Vandals flee. The people of Carthage, too, welcomed Belisarius as a liberator and also a hero. As time passed, the Vandal kingdom disappeared, meaning Belisarius and his men could return home. When they arrived, the streets of the city flooded with cheers of celebration for Belisarius and his men. For his success, Justinian would award Belisarius a triumph, the greatest honor a general could receive. The reconquest of Rome. The city of Rome was not a part of the Roman Empire, which really bothered Justinian. In order to gain the city, Justinian needed another reason for war. Once he found a reason, he sought out for vengeance and restoration for the empire. He calls for Belisarius to prepare his fleet and sail to Italy. Belisarius sailed to Sicily, and the town too surrendered to him. Meanwhile, Justinian sends money to the Franks in exchange for them to invade Italy from the western side, due to Belisarius' doubts that he doesn't have enough men. When planning their invasion, a man-sized pipe in the aqueduct is located by one of Belisarius' men. Belisarius orders for some men to cause distraction so that the rest of the troops can sneak through the pipe. Once they make it through, they begin their attack that results in their opponents surrendering. Belisarius next camps out at Neapolis. He writes a letter to the Pope asking for permission to invade peacefully. Once he gets permission from the Pope, Belisarius and his men invade Rome and complete the task in order to retake the city. Once again, after 60 years, the city of Rome was ruled by Romans. However, some locations in Rome remained Ostrogothic. Belisarius sends the key to Rome back home to Justinian, and also requests more men due to the fear that there weren't enough to defend the walls. The Ostrogoths did not come for some time, so Belisarius sent out his troops. As he does, the Ostrogoths begin their invasion. Belisarius and his men break through the enemy line and begin heading for the gates of Rome. The Ostrogoths were gaining on the men. Belisarius gets through the gates, and the Ostrogoths settle for a siege. The Ostrogoths then damage the aqueduct to cut off a water supply. Without running water, the mills won't operate and the city would starve. However, Belisarius crafts up a plan. He decides to put mills on boats and tide them across the Tiber so that flowing water would operate the mills and running water and food supply would still continue. Belisarius and his men made Roman citizens soldiers. They pleaded with Belisarius to let them die in battle rather than starvation. So Belisarius made them soldiers, however, he wouldn't force them into service, but instead organized them into squadrons. Belisarius and his men were victorious against a portion of the Ostrogoths, but unsure of how much longer they would succeed. So Belisarius writes Justinian and requests more men, to which he sends 1,600 cavalrymen. The Ostrogoths send Belisarius a request for a 3-month truce, or so what they thought was a truce. Later that night, the Ostrogoths tried to take Rome by surprise, but Belisarius, being the great general he was prepared for anything. As their fight continues, Belisarius loses hope, which led to a new plan. He would relieve Arminium, but doing so without fighting, and he split his men into 3 sections. Luckily, his plan goes accordingly, and Italy was conquered after 5 long years. Justinian is ecstatic, as he now had control of Africa and Italy and made them additions to his new empire. Problems with the Persians. Problems with the Persians resurface. So Justinian sends a man named Citus, since he'd been in the region since the First Persian War. Citus was able to make an agreement with the Armenian men. Unfortunately, there was a miscommunication in battle, causing some of the men to retreat against Citus and his men. Because of this, Citus was isolated, but later found by the Armenians, who killed him. Justinian then sends a man named Buzes. Buzes invited the men to sign a treaty, but Armenians don't trust the Romans. However, a man named John among the Armenians knew Buzes. Later on, for a reason unknown, Buzes killed John. The word of John's death made its way to Khosrow, who was the king of the Persians, and Khosrow joins the war. Khosrow captured the citizens of Antioch, stole all their wealth, and left it to the ground. Justinian decides it's time to make a treaty with Khosrow, and Khosrow asked for thousands of pounds as gold as well as an annual tribute. Until his gold was brought to him, Khosrow raided the Byzantines' party. Khosrow pays for a chariot race and bets on the Greens to win. He also had rebuilt a new city for the citizens he captured in Antioch and renamed it We Antioch Khusra, also known as Khosrow's better version of Antioch. Khosrow's actions exposed the weak aspects of the Roman Empire, so a war began. Belisarius returned home and organized a raid into Persia. The Persians withdraw from the war for the year. However, the following year they return, and Khosrow is aiming for Jerusalem. Belisarius gathers his men to fight and was prepared to possibly die in service to the empire. But as the war starts, a silent death begins. The plague. The plague reached Constantinople in 542, killing many citizens rapidly. It was believed that the plague was caused by Y. pestis, also known as Yersinia pestis, a parasite of rat flea. The plague was so harsh that 1 in 4 Roman citizens were killed. The plague begins to negatively impact the economy. Citizens were in isolation and no one was seen on the streets unless they were carrying a corpse. Cemeteries filled with the corpses, so many were dying that much of Constantinople land was dug up to bury them one by one. Due to a lack of space, they began to dig mass graves. Once those were filled, bodies were dumped into the sea and even resorted to packing corpses into the guard towers that lined the walls of the city. Harvests couldn't be collected and crops starting to rot. This led to people beginning to starve. This plague was so bad that most of the citizens got the disease, including Justinian. Justinian falls into a coma, leaving Theodora to take reign for Justinian. Theodora was a strong leader. She made military decisions, she held the court together, and had men of power arrested. She took no chances of people trying to harm the empire while it was vulnerable. But the war with the Persians was far from over. But the plague had reached them too. A quarter of the Roman population died, but by good fortune, Justinian awoke from his coma. Life after the plague. After the destruction from the plague, Romans couldn't afford to support the war in Italy any longer. Despite all their hard work, Belisarius and Justinian's legacy to take Italy had been trumped by the Ostrogoths. In 548, Theodora unfortunately dies of cancer. Justinian begins to rebuild Rome once more. He prevents conflict from turning into war, he reboosts the economy, he fixes taxation, and once more tries to heal the split church between the Monophysites and the Orthodox in Theodora's honor. Final moments of reign. Once the empire is refunctioning, money is restored and can be used to pay soldiers and equip the troops. Justinian's idea of the last company begins, a group of men to execute his will and restore Rome at last. Justinian chooses a man named Bessas to retake Lazica. He chooses a man named Scholasticus, a court eunuch, to command forays against the Slavs to the north and retake Italy. Once again has Narses to be another leader of his army. The army was victorious in Lazica. The last company and their men take Petra and make peace with Persia. They were victorious again in the Balkans. And next Narses kicks the Ostrogoths out of Italy indefinitely. A city named Hispania requests Justinian to send men. The plague returns, however not as harsh as last time. The plague allows the Bulgars to come in and raid the empire. Justinian calls for Belisarius for one last service to his empire. When going to battle, Belisarius' men outnumbered the Bulgars, causing them to flee. People that played a major role in the empire began to die. Tribonian died in 542. Theodora died in 548. John the Cappadocian died sometime in the 550s. and Belisarius died in 565. Alone, Justinian tries to consolidate his achievements at last. He reconciled the church and unfortunately died in 565, months after Belisarius. In his time as emperor, Justinian made exponential growth to the empire. He had moments of victory and failure. He rationalized law. He stood with an empire through plague and avoided civil war. Justinian sacrificed everything. He emptied the Byzantine treasury. He taxed strongly and created continuous miles of new borders. Overall, Justinian had a respectable dream for Rome and gave all his efforts to make it come true.